Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast, the show where we like to really get into the nitty-gritty of some fascinating historical events.
We like to call them deep dives.
Exactly, deep dives.
Yeah.
And today we're diving headfirst into one that I'm sure you've all heard of, Watergate.
Oh, yeah. Watergate's one of those events that just captures the imagination, a real political thriller.
It is. I mean, just the name itself, Watergate, it sounds kind of mysterious, doesn't it?
Yeah, it has a certain ring to it.
So for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with Watergate, could you give us a quick rundown of what went down?
Well, in the simplest terms, Watergate was a massive political scandal that rocked the United States in the early 1970s and ultimately led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon.
Nixon, yeah. Okay, so let's rewind back to 1972, June, to be exact. The place is the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex in Washington, D.C. What happens?
So it all starts with a seemingly minor incident. A security guard named Frank Wells is doing his rounds late at night.
Like a normal night.
Yeah.
Just checking things out.
Exactly, routine stuff. But then he notices something strange on a door in the building, a piece of tape.
Tape, like Scotch tape.
Yeah, it was on one of the door latches, preventing the door from closing properly.
Okay, that is kind of odd. I mean, I'd probably notice that too if I was a security guard.
Right. It's not something you'd usually expect to see. So Wills removes the tape, thinking it's maybe just some kids messing around, and continues his patrol. But when he comes back later, he finds the tape back on the latch.
Someone really wanted that door to stay unlocked.
That's what Wills thought, too. It was enough to make him suspicious, so he called the police.
And I'm guessing these weren't just any police officers who responded.
You're right. It was a plainclothes unit called the Bum Squad. They were known for blending in on the streets, often posing as vagrants or drunks to catch criminals.
Wow, a real undercover operation.
Yeah, they were the perfect choice for a situation like this. So they arrive at the Watergate, and what do they find? 5 men inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
The DNC. So this wasn't just some random break-in.
Definitely not. Things start to get really interesting when they identify one of the burglars as James McCord, a former CIA officer.
A former CIA officer breaking into the DNC.
Okay, this is getting good.
And it gets even better or worse, depending on how you look at it. McCord was also the security chief for the Committee for the Re-election of the President Nixon's re-election campaign.
Hold on. So we've got a former CIA officer working for the president's re-election campaign, breaking into the headquarters of the opposing political party.
Yep. And that's not all. The other 4 men arrested also had ties to the CIA and Cuban exile groups.
This is like something out of a spy movie.
It really is. And to make things even more suspicious, the police found all sorts of incriminating evidence at the scene. Lockpicks cameras, a shortwave receiver for listening in on frequencies, you name it.
It sounds like they were pretty well equipped.
Oh yeah, they came prepared.
Yeah.
And perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the money they found thousands of dollars in sequentially numbered $100 bills.
Sequentially numbered bills. Why would that be significant? It suggests that the money came from a slush fund, something that could be traced back to its source.
So it's starting to look like this break-in was part of something much bigger and more organized than just a few guys looking to steal some office supplies.
Exactly. And that's where 2 very determined reporters from the Washington Post come in. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
Ah, yes, the dynamic duo of investigative journalism.
That's them. Woodward and Bernstein were relentless in their pursuit of the truth about Watergate. They followed the money trail, the connections, and they had a little help from a mysterious source known as Deep Throat.
Deep Throat. Now that's a name that sends chills down my spine. Wasn't he like a high-ranking government official?
He was. Deep Throat turned out to be Mark Felt, who was the associate director of the FBI at the time.
Wow, the FBI. So even within the government, there were people who knew something was wrong and were willing to speak out.
Yes, and Deep Throat's information was crucial in helping Woodward and Bernstein navigate the maze of lies and cover-ups that surrounded Watergate.
So we've got a break-in at the DNC with ties to the president's re-election campaign, money trails, mysterious sources. It's already sounding like a pretty wild story.
It gets even wilder, trust me.
Yeah.
But I think we need to take a step back for a moment and consider the context of all of this. Remember, this was 1972. The Vietnam War was raging. The country was deeply divided.
Yeah, it was a pretty turbulent time in American history.
Exactly. There was a lot of distrust in the government, a lot of uncertainty, and it seems that some people in power were willing to exploit that for their own gain.
So maybe this break-in wasn't just about winning an election. Maybe it was about something even bigger, control power. Who knows?
That's a great question, and one that I think we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into this story. But one thing's for sure, Watergate was a turning point in American history. It forced the country to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself, and it had a profound impact on how we view power and accountability.
Oh, I'm definitely hooked. I can't wait to hear more about how this all unfolds.
Oh, you won't be disappointed. The story of Watergate is full of twists and turns, betrayals, and ultimately a reckoning that nobody could have predicted.
And before we get to all that, I want to remind our listeners to hit that subscribe button. That way you won't miss the next part of our Watergate deep dive. Because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next.
It's about to get really intense.
Oh, it is. So buckle up, everyone, and get ready for part 2 of our deep dive into Watergate.
All right, so we left off with Woodward and Bernstein hot on the trail of the Watergate break-in and the Nixon administration trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug.
Yeah, a classic cover-up. But as we all know, cover-ups rarely work, especially when you have tenacious reporters like Woodward and Bernstein on the case.
Exactly. Those guys were like dogs with a bone. They weren't going to let go until they got to the bottom of it.
And they had help, remember, Deep Throat feeding them crucial information.
Right. Mark felt he was a key player in all of this.
So as the investigation heats up, what happens? Does Nixon just come clean?
Oh, no, not at all. He doubles down, denies any involvement, claims it's all a big misunderstanding.
But the evidence is mounting, right?
It is. The money trail leads back to the CRP, the Committee for the Re-election of the President. There are all these shady connections to the CIA.
And those sequentially numbered bills? That's pretty hard to explain away.
Yeah, that was a big red flag. But Nixon, he's a fighter. He's not going down without a fight.
And this is where things start to get really messy.
Oh, yeah, it's about to get real. So remember the burglars who were caught red-handed at the DNC?
Yeah, those guys.
Well, they're put on trial, and the judge presiding over the case is John Sirica.
Judge Sirica, wasn't he a pretty tough judge?
He was known for being no-nonsense, and he suspected there was more to the story than met the eye. So he does something pretty clever. He sentences the burglars to potentially very long prison terms.
Whoa, trying to scare them into talking.
Exactly. He's hoping that the threat of a long stretch in the slammer will convince them to spill the beans about who else was involved.
And does it work?
It does. One of the burglars, James McCord, the former CIA officer we talked about, sends a letter to Judge Sirica.
A letter. What does he say?
In the letter, McCord claims that there was perjury during the trial and that witnesses were pressured to lie under oath.
So basically he's saying there was a massive cover-up.
Yes, and he implies that the cover-up goes all the way to the top to the White House.
This is huge. A bombshell.
It was McCord's letter, throws gasoline on the fire. The media goes into a frenzy, the public is outraged, and Congress can no longer ignore what's happening.
So what does Congress do?
They decide to launch their own investigation. They form a special committee to get to the bottom of Watergate.
The Senate Watergate Committee? I remember seeing pictures of those hearings on TV.
Oh yeah, those hearings were a major media event. They were televised nationwide and everyone was glued to their screens.
It must have been like watching a real-life political thriller unfold.
It was. And it was during these hearings that one of the most shocking revelations of the entire Watergate saga came to light.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What was it?
A former White House aide named Alexander Butterfield dropped a bombshell. He revealed that Nixon had a secret taping system installed in the Oval Office.
He was recording his conversations. Wow, that's sneaky, but also kind of brilliant in a twisted way.
Yeah, it was Nixon's way of ensuring that he had a record of everything that was said in his presence, probably never thinking that those tapes would one day be used against him.
Well, they say, live by the sword, die by the sword.
Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly, these tapes become the holy grail of the Watergate investigation. Everyone wants to get their hands on them because they believe the tapes hold the key to unlocking the truth about Nixon's involvement in the cover-up.
But I'm guessing Nixon wasn't too keen on handing them over.
Oh no, he fought tooth and nail to keep those tapes secret.
Wow.
He claimed something called executive privilege.
Executive privilege, what's that?
It's basically the right of the president to keep certain communications confidential, especially those relating to national security or diplomacy.
So he's saying that releasing the tapes would jeopardize national security.
That was his argument, but a lot of people saw it as a blatant attempt to obstruct justice, to hide the truth.
And this is where things escalate even further, right?
Absolutely. It turns into a major constitutional crisis. The question is, does executive privilege trump the need for evidence in a criminal investigation? This battle over the tapes goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow, high stakes. So what does the Supreme Court decide?
Well, in a landmark ruling, the court orders Nixon to hand over the tapes. They reject his claim of executive privilege, saying that no one, not even the president, is above the law.
That's a pretty big blow to Nixon. It's like the walls are closing in.
He's running out of options, but he's still got one more trick up his sleeve.
What does he do?
He decides to release edited transcripts of the tapes to the public.
Edited transcripts, so not the actual recording.
Nope, just transcripts and heavily edited ones at that script bin. He's trying to control the narrative to make himself look less guilty.
But I bet that didn't go over too well.
You're right. It backfired big time. The edited transcripts were full of gaps and inconsistencies, which only fueled suspicions that Nixon was hiding something.
So the pressure on him must have been immense at this point.
Oh, yeah, it was. He's facing impeachment charges in the House of Representatives. The public is calling for his resignation. Even his own party is starting to turn against him.
So what happens next? Does he finally release the tapes?
Well, he kind of has to, but not before one final bombshell drops. The smoking gun tape is revealed.
A smoking gun tape that sounds ominous.
It was. This tape was a recording of a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in.
And what's on this tape that's so damning?
On the tape, Nixon is clearly heard instructing Haldeman to tell the FBI to back off their investigation of Watergate.
He's telling them to obstruct justice.
Yes, and he's doing it on tape. It's the smoking gun that everyone had been looking for proof that Nixon was involved in the cover-up from the very beginning.
This is a game over for Nixon, right?
Yeah, pretty much. With the release of the smoking gun tape, Nixon's support completely collapses. He's lost the trust of the American people, the confidence of Congress, and even his closest allies are abandoning him.
So what does he do?
He resigns. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon becomes the first and only U.S. president to resign from office.
Wow, what a dramatic end to a truly unbelievable story.
The Watergate scandal was a turning point in American history.
Yeah.
It exposed the dark side of power, the dangers of secrecy, and the importance of accountability.
It also showed us the power of the press. Woodward and Bernstein's relentless reporting played a huge role in bringing down a president.
Absolutely. They showed that even the most powerful person in the world is not above the law. So Nixon is gone, disgraced, resigned in the face of almost certain impeachment.
The country must have been in shock. I mean, to have your president resign like that, unfunkable.
It was a really turbulent time. There was a lot of anger, a lot of uncertainty. But amidst all the chaos, there was also a sense of relief.
Relief.
Yeah, relief that the truth had finally come out. Relief that the system had worked in a way.
That justice had been served.
Exactly. Even though Nixon himself never admitted to any wrongdoing, the fact that he was forced to resign was a powerful message that no one is above the law.
And it wasn't just Nixon, right? Weren't a lot of his top aides and advisors also implicated in the scandal?
Oh, yeah. A whole bunch of them ended up going to jail for their roles in the cover-up. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, some big names.
It's crazy to think that so many people were involved in this conspiracy. I mean, what were they thinking?
Well, I think it's important to remember the context, the political climate at the time. There was this win-at-all-costs mentality, a belief that the ends justified the means.
And that anything goes in politics.
Yeah, and I think Watergate really shattered that illusion. It showed that there are consequences for breaking the law, even if you're the president of the United States.
So Watergate was definitely a dark chapter in American history. But did any good come out of it?
That's a good question, and the answer is yes. Actually, quite a bit of good came out of it.
Really?
Well, for one thing, it led to some major reforms aimed at preventing future abuses of power.
Reforms like?
Well, for example, there were stricter campaign finance laws put in place to try to limit the influence of money in politics.
Makes sense. I mean, that was a big part of the Watergate scandal, right? The use of illegal campaign funds to finance all these dirty tricks.
Exactly. And there were also new laws to protect whistleblowers, people who come forward to expose wrongdoing within the government.
Like Deep Throat.
Yes, exactly like Deep Throat. Before Watergate, whistleblowers were often ostracized or even punished for speaking out. But after Watergate, there was a much greater appreciation for the role that whistleblowers play in holding those in power accountable.
So in a way, Watergate kind of strengthened American democracy.
I think so. It showed that the system could be broken, but it also showed that it could be fixed. It reaffirmed the importance of checks and balances, the rule of law, and the freedom of the press.
And the power of investigative journalism.
Absolutely. Woodward and Bernstein became household names. They showed the world that even a couple of reporters armed with nothing but notebooks and a healthy dose of skepticism could take on the most powerful man in the world and win.
It's an inspiring story, really. It reminds us that we all have a role to play in holding our leaders accountable and that the truth will eventually come out.
I agree. And I think it's a story that's still relevant today. We're still grappling with many of the same issues that were at the heart of Watergate: abuse of power, government secrecy, the role of the media in a democracy.
So maybe Watergate wasn't just a scandal. Maybe it was a wake-up call, a reminder that we can't take our democracy for granted.
I think that's a great way to put it. Watergate was a tragedy in many ways, but it also forced America to look in the mirror and to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself.
And hopefully to learn from its mistakes.
Let's hope so,
Yeah.
because as the saying goes, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Well said. Well, folks, that's our deep dive into Watergate. A story of intrigue, betrayal, and ultimately redemption. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful.
And maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Exactly inspiring. Because at the end of the day, Watergate is a story about the power of truth and the resilience of American democracy.
And the importance of staying vigilant. Never stop questioning, never stop demanding accountability from those in power.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's it for this episode of Tell Me More Stories Told Us podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the annals of history. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.